Hi, I'm back again. More of Ardamin Clone 7, Chapter 2. The world is running down. Ardamin lay on the floor where he was dropped, unable to move up to the bed provided in his cell. His muscles involuntarily twitched. He didn't like the way Tico treated his friends. He closed his eyes, exhausted from the experience. He didn't think he could sleep, twitching and jerking about, but no sooner had he closed his eyes, blackness enveloped him. An hour passed before Murphy reappeared. She saw the now still body of Ardamin on the floor. Worried, she opened the cell and touched his neck. There was a pulse. It was strong, slow and steady. She took the pillow from the bed and placed it under Ardamin's head. She felt guilty of his treatment and how Tico had called him inhuman. He sure looked human. He felt human too. Damn, she was falling for him, but she knew that they were coming for him and that he would probably be dead shortly after he was taken to Vegas. She tried to rebuke herself, that it was just hormones. Besides, she was older than him. Murphy was 46, but Ardamin looked to be in his early 20s. But if he really was a clone, he may only be a few years old, maybe even only a few months. Still, the attraction was there and she couldn't help herself. Perhaps it was the lack of decent male companionship. It seems most of the men here were complete sleazebags. What happened to the good men of the world? They seemed to be gone from the world. Those that were left, in Murphy's eyes, weren't worth the time. They were either scum or like Chucky, away with the fairies and harmless, or completely crazy and very deadly. Poor Chucky. She thought about how the man had witnessed the change in his wife from human to zombie and how she had then bit her children and tried to bite him. Of course he killed her. He had to, but he couldn't kill his kids or himself, though he tried. He once mumbled about how he put the revolver to his head and pulled the trigger. The gun was empty and his life was spared. But he was so traumatized he broke from reality and there didn't seem to be any way back for him. Others made fun of him. Murphy and Tico didn't. They both pitied him. She had often said, when she saw him, there but for the grace of God go I. She was looking at the sleeping man before him and internally sighed. Unfortunately, you, my friend, are somebody I will never get to know. She checked his vital signs again, and despite the occasional twitch, his heartbeat was strong and his breath was regular. She stood up and went to go, stopped at the cell door, looked back at him one more time. The guilt she felt over what they had done was palpable, and she swallowed hard, the lump welling in her throat. She hadn't felt this bad when she killed her husband of 15 years. He tried to bite her and turn her into a zombie. She hesitated before pulling the trigger on his Glock. She had felt some guilt as his brain spread across the house they had lived in for the past 5 years, but she felt much worse now. Her husband was turned. He was trying to kill her. This man, clone, whatever he was innocent and had done nothing except defend himself. And she would have killed the 3 bikers instead of just wounding them. She closed the heavy bars behind her, and the guard, whom she barely noticed, locked the cell door. It clunked heavily, just like her throat. Thank you. A weak voice came from behind her. She turned to see Ardamin awake. Her heart lifted a little and then sank as she saw the bars between them. What for? She replied, the guilt swelling up inside her. For speaking up for me. For checking on me. She blushed and turned to leave. She wished she could do more, but with the guard standing right there was nothing she could do. Murphy's body slumped a little. She nodded and walked away. Ardamin closed his eyes and lay there on the cold concrete floor. He thought of the people he was letting down by not reaching his destination. He was the last of the support teams, and to end up here in a cell, he blamed himself. While it was not really his fault, he felt it was. He could have bypassed this centre and headed into the nearest town, except he didn't really know where the nearest town would be. Sure, he had figured out he was in Arizona, somewhere in northern Arizona. He remembered that much. But Matt Ardamin was a child when he visited here, 12 years old. That was 61 years ago, and he had never been based in Arizona, so the only time he had ever been in the state was as a child. If only he had bypassed the centre and tried to find the main road. He dared not dwell on his guilt or the decision to stop here. He had done it and now had to wait and see what Tico's next move would be. Until then, all he could do was rest. Something all the clones were pre-programmed with was the ability to rest whenever or wherever they could. They just willed themselves to shut down completely or to shut down and remain alert. He healed quicker in full sleep, so he just shut himself down and fell asleep. 3 hours passed before he was woken by his jailer. The guard kicked at Ardamin's feet, staying as far back as possible. Ardamin opened his eyes and saw a young man with a pistol pointed at him. "Wake up," the young guard said. Ardamin stretched and the guard exited the cell. He sat up on the concrete floor, looked up to see what he knew to be a zombie controller. Ardamin was not expecting to see one, at least not one interacting with living people. The controller was almost like a normal human male. His head was larger than average, almost half a head size larger in height and width. Ardamin assumed that the extra space was needed for the ability to telepathically control several hundred drones. Its skin colour was bluish grey, but it didn't look as though it was dead, as most people still left alive thought. No, it was breathing. Ardamin could see its chest expand and contract as it breathed. It stood almost as tall as Ardamin himself, but its eyes were yellow and cat-like, removing any doubt that the thing was human. Without speaking, it turned to Tico standing next to it and nodded slightly. Tico smiled. From around the corner came 4 drones. These were people once, and they did look like walking dead people, but Ardamin knew differently. He knew what had changed them. He had studied it closely. Nanotechnology. Technology so small that laboratory technicians could barely see them under a microscope. But under an electron microscope, they were clearly visible. Tiny machines able to manipulate genes and DNA, stuff they had dreamt of for years, was changing the human race into what everyone thought was the Walking Dead. But no, they were alive and breathing of sorts. The standard zombie, or as Ardamin knew them, drones, did breathe, eat and drink. No, they did not eat brains like the zombie movies, but they could exist on a small ingestion of any type of meat-based substance. For example, a 1-inch cube of meat could sustain a drone for a whole week. Water or water-based liquid was also needed, but only a tiny amount, not the half a gallon a normal human would require. They only needed to ingest their food and water once per 7 days and had lasted more than 3 months in some form of starvation mode without food or water. They needed to breathe, but not every few seconds like the average human. One lasted a day without breath in a vacuum chamber before collapsing. Once exposed to the air, it began to breathe again. They were conducting more experiments regarding that when he left. They bit into their victims in order to inject large quantities of nanomachines into the person, irrevocably changing their victims into drones. They had tried to reprogram the nanomachines to change the drones back into humans, but the results were not encouraging. Once, they did manage to change a drone back to human appearance, but the brain damage was something beyond repair. They died. Their brains had turned to liquid. They had tried with as many drones as the clones could capture, but nothing could be done to repair the damage. Colonel Matt Ardamin was very disheartened with the results and said that unless there was something new to be learned from the captured victims, then the capture was no longer a priority. They had tried with 2 other types they had managed to capture. The ones Tico's men had called speeders and bricks. The only type they had met so far that had eluded the capture was the controller. They always chose some horrific end rather than be captured alive. They always managed to explode their head upon capture, covering the clones in brains and blood. And there, before Ardamin 7, stood an actual controller, alive, breathing and obviously issuing instructions to the drones that seemed to move with ease around his human captors. He had so many questions he wanted to ask the controller, but if he did get the chance, he would kill it where it stood. He thought of leaping up and attacking it, but there were guns pointed at him. It would be suicide to try. Besides, he was curious as to how and why Tico and the controller had struck some sort of alliance or agreement. The 4 drones entered the cell and took up a position in each corner facing Ardamin. Their never blinking eyes watched his every movement. The guard closed the cell door and the men around lowered their weapons and clicked their safeties on. Then everybody left. Ardamin was confused. They just left without saying anything to him. They didn't gloat about the victory. The drones weren't being ordered to attack him. They just watched him. He waited for the order to come. He had expected it to be some kind of sick sport, watching the Zeds rip this poor bastard apart. Well, I think I'll leave it about there. And I think we'll finish chapter 2 next time, if you don't mind these longer videos. Try and get through it a bit quicker for you. If you like the story, please go out and buy my book. It's greatly appreciated. That's it for now. I'll say goodbye and hope to see you next time. Take care. There we go, like an old grandpa. Who gives a toss? Okay. Pop. She hesitated before the pulling rather than try and squeeze it all into one thing. And now I just lost my place. Please support me and buy my book. Is that asking too much? That's the book. Please go out and buy it. Hopefully that'll upload.